You're listening to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, February 11th, 2021.
We're way past the hog butcher of the world, and we really haven't gotten another image. We're not this Picasso statue. We're not the Bean. We're not Wrigley Field or United Center. But if there was a way to have an image of all the elevated loop, that would be the image of Chicago.
Welcome to the Deerfield Public Library Podcast, where we interview authors, artists, and other notable people from our suburb, Deerfield, from Chicagoland, and from the whole world. I'm Dylan Zavagno, the Adult Services Coordinator at the library. Our guest is Patrick T. Reardon, author of The Loop, the L tracks that shaped and saved Chicago, recently published by Southern Illinois University Press. Pat Reardon worked as an urban affairs and features reporter at the Chicago Tribune during a 33-year career with the paper. He's an essayist, poet, literary critic, and Chicago history expert. And he argues in this book that the loop of L tracks downtown is the most important structure in the history of Chicago. It's a fascinating book and a provocative conversation that invites you to consider what makes Chicago a unique world city. Here's my conversation with Patrick T. Reardon. Pat, thank you so much for being here. Your book combines so many disciplines. You say it's urban history, biography, architecture, engineering, transportation, culture, politics. I might add poetry to that. It's hard to wrestle down, but you are really guiding us through it, both the history of the structure of the loop, the L tracks itself, and the idea of how it changed Chicago. I thought I'd start by asking you about the comparison you make at the beginning of the book to the Brooklyn Bridge.
Isn't that wonderful? I have to give myself a pat on the back. When I realized that I could make that comparison, it was just so like, whoa, how can you do that? And yet, because the Brooklyn Bridge is this huge thing that spans the whatever river it is from Brooklyn to New York, and it's this monumental thing that was designed to be monumental, and it's like you can't avoid it. And yet, the elevated loop, if you're looking from the outside, from the air, you can't see it. You can't. You can never see the entire elevated loop, because unless you were like in a satellite straight above, and even then the shadows of the buildings. Anyway, so this little dinky 2-mile long rectangle of tracks that are just 20 feet above the earth. How can that compare to the Brooklyn Bridge? Well, in three ways. One, it's this transportation thing that linked Chicago from the north side to the south side to the west side. Everybody could use it in the same way the Brooklyn Bridge linked Brooklyn with New York. At the time, Brooklyn was an independent city. And what this did was it unified in a transportation way Brooklyn and New York and Manhattan. And the elevated loop unified all these diverse parts of the city, which were very much separated because of the river. Because of the river, you couldn't get from one side to the other very easily, except through some bridges. But even that was, the river tended to really, we've got the north side, the south side, and the west side. It's still there today. So you get transportation. Secondly, the Brooklyn Bridge made Manhattan this central place where people from other boroughs would come to work, and live. And Manhattan became a playground, the neighborhood for all of New York City, to some extent. I argue that the elevated loop created a space that was even more concentrated and more, it felt more like a second neighborhood to everybody. Everybody in Chicago grew up and you felt comfortable in your own neighborhood, but because of divisions in the city, you didn't necessarily feel comfortable in other neighborhoods. Well, you did feel comfortable downtown for the most part. Obviously, the poor probably didn't feel quite as comfortable. African Americans and other ones who were marginalized and the victims of racism probably didn't feel quite as comfortable. But it was a place where it was expected to be diverse. It was expected to be this place that everybody could share, and everybody did share. There's stories in there, the story of the Rutabaga Club, these altar boys from Resurrection Church on the west side, near where I grew up. And they did what I used to do. 3 of them, 4 of them would get together, go downtown, and just play around. They just hang out. It was a playground. So it became this place that unified Chicago at a time where Chicago was still very much divided. Thirdly, and this is a key thing that nobody really noticed, the Brooklyn Bridge boosted the real estate on the New York side of where it lands. And so if you're in the air and you're taking a picture of Manhattan, you see this great concentration of big buildings in the southern tip of Manhattan. And a part of why they're there is because of the Brooklyn Bridge. You also have a concentration of tall buildings up near Central Park. So they're, in a way, New York has 2 downtowns, although New Yorkers say they don't have any downtown. All of Manhattan is a downtown. So I'll leave that for them to decide. With Chicago, if you take a picture from the air, you see this dense concentration of tall buildings. And you can't tell where the Loop is, but the Loop is in the center of that, and all the other stuff built out around it. And my argument in the book is that from the moment the elevated loop was built, in fact, even before it was built, the land inside the elevated tracks was so important, was so valuable compared to the land outside, that people invested their money. And when they invested their money, they could not walk away from it. They could not think, well, I can just build something a few blocks away and that'll draw people to it. The loop was the end lines of that concentration. And so throughout the years, where other downtowns like Cleveland, Detroit, Omaha, Phoenix, all kind of fell apart because the downtowns not just wandered away, but they jumped out to the suburbs. Chicago had enough investment. The power brokers in Chicago had enough money invested there that they couldn't walk away. So in the 3 ways, the elevated loop is like the Brooklyn Bridge. Although, again, looking at them, you wouldn't think that.
Well, there are some other similarities, just with the kind of symbol of the modern age of steel and the rivets, and but you describe the loop as stumpy. I really love that word you use several times.
It really is stumpy, and yet here's the interesting thing: if you walk along the streets in downtown, especially if you're along the streets where the L is right over your head, but you don't even have to have it over your head. You can just hear it. First of all, you hear it. And if you're talking to somebody on the phone or in person, you have to say, hold on, let the L go by. And you have to make a pause. So, and also it's right over, it looms over you in a way the skyscrapers don't. If you think about walking through the loop and you walk past the Monadnock building or any of the other skyscrapers, you see the first floor. You don't see everything above you. You have to stand back and look up if you're going to do that. And you don't do that, especially if you're down there all the time. But you can't avoid hearing and feeling the visceralness of this stumpy thing that's looming over you just 20 feet above you. It's just 20 feet, but it is 20 feet. It is, so it's huge in the way that it fits into the fabric of the downtown in a way that a skyscraper is not huge. A skyscraper, once you get past the second floor, it's like, who cares? That doesn't affect me. I'm on the street. But if you're in the downtown, you hear and feel the vibrations of the trains going by, and you walk under it and you see the shadows of the on the streets underneath it. It's a beautiful thing. And also, you're worried about pigeons dropping.
Oh, of course.
So you got all that going on.
Let me read just this paragraph, because you're describing a sensitivity to every different facet of experiencing the loop, historically, but also just viscerally. So I'm just going to read a couple sentences from the opening that I think prove this is not a dry history, and there's some exciting language here. While the bridge is best viewed from afar, the elevated loop in Chicago is a much more visceral experience, felt and heard as much as seen. The office worker or shopper or tourist who, on a sunny day, walks from State Street across Lake Street enters, for that short time, a world of sharp-edged patterned shadows. The latticed steel girders are a forest through which cars, trucks, and pedestrians dart, while overhead a train rumbles, overwhelming most other street sounds and halting conversations, even though the screeching of metal wheels on metal tracks during turns has been greatly dampened in recent years.
Yeah, that visceralness of it is what I wanted to communicate, and I'm glad you picked those sentences, because they really kind of capture what I was trying to communicate.
Well, it becomes the loop structure itself in your book becomes kind of a hero. I thought of it at this kind of, it's a stumpy upstart and it's loud and annoying, but it really has this kind of heart of gold in protecting the city or something. I'm personifying it too much.
But wait, you're personifying it the same way Nelson Algren did.
Right.
When he's talking about Chicago is a woman with a broken nose, and its rusty heart is the elevated loop. So, it's the idea that this is something, a personification of Chicago. We're way past the hog butcher of the world, and we really haven't gotten another image. We're not the Picasso statue. We're not the Bean. We're not Wrigley Field or United Center. But if there was a way to have an image of all the elevated loop, that would be the image of Chicago. But now in every movie that is set in Chicago, they always have the elevated loop or some L tracks elsewhere, but usually in the loop, to kind of tell people you're in Chicago, because nowhere else is there an elevated loop.
So I thought maybe to get into the history of how it was created, you could just tell us about the need for a loop originally and kind of paint a picture of Chicago in the late 19th century.
Well, there's. I'm trying to figure out how detailed to get on this. First of all, in 1882, Chicago didn't want elevated tracks. New York had them, and they seemed real dangerous. You got this train going overhead, and it's real heavy and it's real big, and so the city opted for cable cars, which had just been started in San Francisco. And so the cable cars would start from the far end of the city at various points, west and south, and eventually and north, and they would come into the downtown. Well, in San Francisco, what they had was a turntable. The cars and the trains would be short enough that they could be put onto a turntable, and they'd just be turned around. Chicago didn't have space for a turntable, and the solution they came up with was to have a loop of cable around 2 or 3 blocks that would turn the train around. Over time, there were actually 6 different lines going into the downtown, and each one had its own loop. They didn't share the same loop, so there were 6 loops in the downtown area. So anyway, cable was not the solution to transportation for Chicago. So with the World's Fair in 1893, there was set up to bring people out to the site in Hyde Park. And then over the next few years, there were a number of other L train lines put in, 2 in the west, 1 in the south, and 1 was going to come from the north. The problem is the city did not want to have 4 or 6 elevated loops in the downtown area, because that was the way they were going to be turned around. And so they decided, we're going to have one union loop. They called it the union loop. Well, actually, some people wanted to call it the parallelogram or the quadrilateral. And it was like, luckily, that didn't go very far. Can you imagine, I live in the quadrilateral. The four people who own the four lines, they couldn't figure out how to do it, because who would pay for it? How would you do it? And then a guy named Charles Yerkes steps in and buys, or he's starting that he becomes an owner, or the owner of the north side one that's still being built. And so he is trying to get them to work together. And he's a corrupt guy, but he's also a transportation visionary. And he eventually finds the way. He gets them to agree to let him build the elevated loop. Now, before the elevated loop was built, each of these lines would come into the edge of the downtown, but they couldn't come inside the downtown because the city council didn't want, and city leaders didn't want to have all these elevated loops there. So you would get to, say, 12th Street or Congress coming up the south, and you'd have to get off the train and walk in, or take some other a cable car or something to get into the city. So Yerkes is the one who said, all right, I can do it.
Well, I wanted to ask you about Yerkes because you write that Chicago will put a plaque up for anything at the drop of a hat. But we don't really celebrate Yerkes, even though he's also responsible for the London Tube. And he's celebrated over there as the person who brought the 20th century to London.
Exactly. Yeah, what the problem, first of all, Yerkes uniformly has been in Chicago histories, starting from the time that he was in Chicago to, the end of the 1890s to today, is demonized. He is described as the most corrupt person ever. In fact, Harold Ickes, who was on Franklin Roosevelt's cabinet, who grew up or who lived in Chicago as a young man, said Yerkes was a combination of the enemies in World War II, Emperor Hirohito, Benito Mussolini, and Adolf Hitler. Now, I'm sorry, that's a bit of an overstatement. I mean, as bad as Yerkes was as a corrupt guy, anyway, just that's the example, that's the kind of overstatement that was used. And the fact is that there's a lot of basis for that, in as much as he was very corrupt. He would bribe aldermen, he would bribe state senators, he tried to bribe the governor, he tried to bribe in fact, the mayor, Carter Harrison, had a rule that he would not sit in the same room with Yerkes without someone else being there, because he didn't want Yerkes to come out and then blackmail him and say, "Oh, I gave you $100,000," which is the sort of money he was throwing around. Which the late 1890s, 100,000 we're talking like $2 million or more. So anyway. So Yerkes was this really corrupt guy, but Harrison, the same guy who would sit in the room with him, really respected his talents. He knew that he had this tremendous talent. He was just corrupt. But and what he says is the problem that Yerkes had is that all the other business leaders in Chicago just weren't as corrupt as he was. He was better at it, and they didn't like it because he was better at it. Also, a side note is that he divorced his wife in Philadelphia and married this young 20-year-old woman who wore these real slinky gowns, and the wives of the business leaders didn't like Yerkes because of his wife, and the business leaders kind of liked his wife, which is partly why the wives didn't like his wife. Anyway, so Yerkes had a lot going against him, but he was one of these huge personalities. He's demonized for all this, and yet I argue, and nobody else has made this argument, that he was a visionary urban planner. He created the elevated loop that made such an impact on Chicago. And then he goes to London and creates and sets the stage, gets things going for 4 underground lines that, if they hadn't been built when he showed up, they would never have been built. And to get around London today, you would have to take buses. And if you can imagine the kind of traffic problems that would cause, this was a guy who was demonized today, but was really demonized in his time. And yet he created these things that were so important to 2 major world cities and set them. they would be different cities today if it wasn't for him.
Yeah, and that appreciation for if this had gone differently, here's how bad it would have been, is central to the argument in this book. So the other person who's also kind of underappreciated, like maybe the loop itself, is the designer, John Alexander Low Waddle. Is that how you say it?
Yes, right. And the fact that he goes by 4 names should give you an indication of what kind of guy he is. Was this huge personality. Yerkes was this huge personality. Waddle was this huge personality in the area of bridge building, engineering. Even today, he is remembered 120 years later as this major bridge builder who not only built hundreds of bridges throughout this country, but around the world. He was also a guy who published theoretical papers to make the bridges better, and he was a guy who had a huge personality. And the picture, if you see a picture of him, what you get is he's got these swirling mustaches. He's got this curling hair like the Munchkins and the Wizard of Oz, and he's always wearing these medals. He got 4 medals from major governments around the world: Japan, I think it was Italy, China. There were 4, and he would wear these medals everywhere. And the younger guys would make fun of him, but he liked wearing them anyway. So he had never built an elevated structure before, but he got hired by Yerkes to do it. And we have no way of knowing why, because Yerkes, like a lot of powerful people, didn't keep archives. Waddle's archives, if there were any, have long disappeared. The CTA threw out its archives about 20 years ago, so so much for that. But what he did was he did a study of the elevated trains that were in operation already, particularly in New York and Boston, and he made some major changes in the design that made the elevated loop trains and tracks much more stable, much less dealing with vibrations. And he made a lot of changes that improved elevated train structures. In fact, his structure, which was built in 1897, 75% of it today is still in existence. And so it's like it was really built to last. And the guy, I talked to the chief engineer a number of times, and they're just so amazed at the structure. And they use his designs every day for some reason, because they're dealing with it all the time. And the other interesting thing the point I made in the book is, if you look at the elevated structure, and it was built in 4 sections, it's like 4 bridges that are put together. And so I called it a rectangular bridge, because it's first of all a bridge between the north side and the south side and the west side. And it is a bridge from one part of the downtown to the other. It is, nobody has ever, and I thought, can I say that? Well, I said it. So, I mean, I don't know if anybody will pick up on it, but it is a structure that, if you can understand it as like a railroad bridge, you start to see it better as for what it is, which is this really amazing and useful engineering structure.
Well, maybe let's get into now the kind of symbolic level of bringing the city together, because you even write that it's a psychic core to Chicago. And you already mentioned this idea of it being the other neighborhood that you could go and, hang out in, you could go shopping. Maybe you could just talk a bit more about that, and even how that has worked in your own life.
Well, as I said earlier, I was talking about these altar boys who went downtown to goof around. They called themselves the Rutabaga Club. They lived around Laramie and Jackson. I lived around Laramie and Washington. And my brothers and I and our friends would walk down Laramie to Lake Street. We're 11, 12, 13 years old. I mean, it's a different time. And we would walk to the Lake Street L, get on the Lake Street L, which is now the Green Line, take it downtown, and we go to the top of the rock, the top of the Prudential Building, which at the time was the tallest building in Chicago, which gives you an idea that we're talking the early 1960s. And we would go into Marshall Fields and wander around. And I'd always go to the book section in Marshall Field and not buy anything. We never bought anything. We go, there was where Block 37 is, there was some sort of arcade thing there. And we would go in and play pinball machines. We never had much money, so we couldn't stay there very long. But we'd wander around. And so that was that in my own personal life. For the rest of the city, you have to picture, think of the baseball. We have Cubs fans in North Side and on the north side, and White Sox fans on the south side. And it's like, it really is a division that is a real division. And we have, we have neighborhoods that are, part of it, Chicago has always been known for its concentration of similar people in the same neighborhood. So you get hyper populations of whites, hyper populations of African Americans, hyper populations of Hispanics. And when I say hyperpopulation, I mean 90% or more. You get hyper populations of Lithuanians in a neighborhood. It's eased off a lot in the last 20, 30 years, but for most of the century, there would be an Irish neighborhood next to an African American neighborhood, next to a Jewish neighborhood, next to a Polish neighborhood. And it's not just race and ethnicity, it's also religion. It's very much economic status. Poor areas, if you're poor, you're not supposed to go into a rich area unless you're going there to work, unless blah, blah, blah. Anyway, and so you could get a situation where the Gold Coast, the richest part of Chicago at one point, is right next to Cabrini Green, one of the poorest parts of Chicago at the time. When I say right next, I mean like a street apart. And these divisions are all over the city. And then then you get the thing of, you got the Al Capones and the Jane Addamses of the city. You've got a city that brags about being the best, and so if it's the best in good things, that's great, but it's also willing to be the best in bad things. So when you talk about corruption, there was this great book by A.J. Liebling, who was a Manhattanite, and he wrote this book Second City. It's about Chicago's inferiority complex, and he talks about this alderman who was a good alderman. He was not a corrupt alderman, but he said, we've got really bad corruption in Chicago. And Liebling said, well, there's bad corruption in New Jersey and New Orleans. And the alderman said, oh, no, but ours is much worse. So we have the sense, there's this part of our psyche is to want to be, if we're going to have to be bad, we're going to be really bad. And so what the elevated loop did, it created this area where we could all be unified in a way that we weren't unified and had no way of being unified otherwise.
Yeah, it's sort of, the psychic or symbolic versus the physical. There's this interesting back and forth between them because, of course, a lot of those divisions, I was a little skeptical at first of this idea of the loop bringing everyone together because I think about all of the policies in Chicago, that restrictive covenants or federal housing laws that, kept different races apart with redlining and things. But then, the loop is also a policy. It's just a policy that brought people together. It's, and again, it's that idea of what would it have been like if we didn't have the loop? How much more divided would we have been?
Well, there's a chapter there about that highlights an attempt in the 40s to build a new downtown, which would have been on the north side of the river. If you can picture Michigan Avenue, it would be the area east of Michigan all the way to the river. the north branch of the river from like Ontario down. And it would have been exactly the same size, or just about the same size as the elevated loop or the downtown loop. But what it would have done would have been, if it had been built, it would have sucked away all the life out of the downtown. So you think, okay, well, it's just a newer version of a downtown. Well, it would have been on the north side. It would have been next to Michigan Avenue. It would have been owned by the rich people of the north side. If you'd moved it to the west side, it would have been owned by the west side. As it was, where it was, in a way, it was owned by the south side, but there was so much else in between of railroads and other stuff that it was itself the elevated loop created a center that really wasn't a center that was as anchored and locked down as it was once you had the elevated loop.
So there actually was a plan to take it down in the late 60s and 70s, and it was deemed too ugly or a nuisance, or it was going to stop development. And at that moment of change, the loop was really in danger, but the city was also in danger because of everyone fleeing to the suburbs and the rise of suburban malls and things. So can you describe this moment and what was happening where there was debate to take down the loop, but at the same time, saving the loop actually saved the city?
Well, here's the thing. First of all, even before it was finished, there was talk of tearing it down.
Right.
And it was like every 8-10 years, somebody, often a Chicago mayor, would say, we need to take down the elevated loop. And it was over and over and over again, all the way into the 60s and then into the 70s. And in December of 1970, see what the city wanted to do in the 70s, what Mayor Daley, the first, wanted to do was to get subways, federal money to put in subways so that we didn't have to have the elevated loop. And the money wasn't showing up because, well, there wasn't a lot of money to throw around. It would have been billions of dollars. What Daley decided in December of 1973, in secret meetings with the CTA, was that he was going to tear down the Wells Street section of the elevated loop. Just tear it down, and then they figure out how to do it. But the point was, if you tear it down, you are forcing the federal government's hand. Well, they got to give us money because we can't get by without subways. And that may sound crazy, but think about what his son did with Meigsfield, where you woke up one morning and suddenly the Meigsfield runways had these huge X's that bulldozers had put in. And if you think that's crazy, Daley the First got the city started on what was called the Deep Tunnel Project, where they built a deep tunnel to deal with sewage, but it was only half of it. You needed a reservoir system to hold the storm water, so you didn't get the dirty water flowing into the lake, blah blah blah, to ruin our water quality. So they started doing that in the 70s. It is still not finished. We're talking 50 years later, and it is still not finished. So this theory of government, where you tear something down or you start something with the idea, well, they're going to have to give us money. Well, it didn't really work out. So Daley was going to just tear down the Wells Street thing. Well, Paul Gapp, a reporter at the Tribune, got wind of it on January 2nd and put a story in the Tribune in its afternoon edition, and Daley blew a gasket, because he wanted to do it secretly. Because if you do it secretly, then you don't have to worry about people complaining. It's already done. So, all right, stop complaining. It's done. But there were complaints. And he at first denied it, but then it became very clear he was going to do it. But because of Gapp's story, he backed off. So Gapp was the first savior of the loop in the 70s. So Daley goes along. He's still wanting to tear it down. He dies in December of 76. Mike Bolandic, his city council guy, gets appointed to replace him. And so Bolandic wants to tear it down. Well, then in 77, there's an accident on the elevated loop at Lake and Wabash, and a train, three cars of a train fall onto the street below, and 11 people are killed and 180 are injured. It's a really bad accident. And it's an accident that was caused because of the motorman not paying attention. It wasn't any problem with the structure. It was just a bad driver, But Mike Melandic goes to the scene, looks at it, and then walks to a phone booth. For those of you who don't know what a phone booth is, everywhere in the world had phone booths that people would throw a quarter in or whatever and call somebody. Well, he calls the White House. He calls Jimmy Carter and says I don't know if he talked to Carter directly. I'd have to look that up again. But he talked to somebody there saying, we need to have a new subways because this is because of the structure. Well, it wasn't, but anyway, and then he flew and talked to Carter and his transportation secretary. And so it looked like the elevated loop was in trouble. That was in 77. In 78, the momentum is starting. What the city is trying to do is to generate a lot of publicity about what a bad thing the elevated loop is, and we need to tear it down. And meanwhile, an architect by the name of Harry Weiss, who was a significant architect, did a lot of kind of quirky but very good buildings in Chicago and around the world. He loved being an agent provocateur in the city. And so he was sticking it to the city officials, but also pushing what he knew was a vision that was real, that the elevated loop was in its way beautiful, in its gritty way, it was beautiful. In riding the elevated loop, you're looking out windows at the world. Instead of in a subway, you're looking out at walls, at dark walls. So he saw the value of it. And he said, the noise and all that, you can deal with that, but we need to keep it and to recognize that it says something about the character of Chicago.
Well, he even calls it fun, and he says that it makes jaywalking so easy on those streets, and isn't that wonderful? And the shadows are wonderful, and
part of the reason that jaywalking was possible was because Waddell designed the loop in a way that didn't have structures that would block you. If you look at anywhere else on the elevated lines in Chicago, there are steel pieces that keep you from walking underneath. Yeah, X's and various lines. I would use the technical terms, but I get lost in the technical terms. So yeah, he was a big fan of it, and he spent all of 78. He and a few allies fighting to a public relations campaign to say this is something good. We need to keep it. We need to really make sure that we retain it. And he was talking more on the level of transportation and on the level of it's beautiful in an odd way. In a way, he lost that because the state advisory committee ruled that this structure did not belong on the National Register. If it had gotten on the National Register, it would have been a kind of a landmark and it would have been hard to take down. But it ruled against Weiss and in favor of the city. And it partly ruled that way because the Landmarks Preservation Council, a group that was set up earlier in the decade to preserve important structures in Chicago, voted, yeah, let's get rid of it. Because if we can get rid of it, we'll be able to see the pretty buildings better. So nowadays they say, well, we really recognize why it's such a good thing and all blah, blah, blah. But at the time, they were really strong about getting rid of it. Harry Weiss lost. The writing was on the wall in early 79. It's gonna go. It's just a question of time. In fact, still wasn't any federal money for subways, so I don't know what was going to happen. The CTA was really worried. I interviewed one guy from the CTA who talked about, we were afraid that they were going to take out two of the four legs, so you would have just an L there instead of the rectangle. And people from Evanston, for example, would have had to, or the north side of Chicago would have had to take it down, and they'd get off somewhere like around Michigan Avenue or Chicago Avenue and have to walk in or take a bus in, or I mean, it was going to make crazy havoc. So it was dead. It looked like the elevated loop looked like it was dead, even though this money wasn't real available. And then, surprise of surprises, Jane Byrne wins the election against Mike Bilandic, and she comes in, and a month or two into her term, she decides we're going to save the loop. We're not going to tear it down. We're going to refurbish it and use other money that we have, blah, 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 blah. So you had Paul Gapp, a Tribune reporter, Harry Weiss, an architect, and then this radical mayor, Jane Byrne, who became very much establishment after a year or two in office. And they saved it. And from that moment, it has been saved, and more and more has been seen as this kind of emblem and symbol of the character of Chicago.
It's really amazing, and we're running out of time here, but I wanted to just mention a couple things. The other feature of this book is that you trace through literature, through newspapers, advertisements, the term loop, and how you say that it's linguistic alchemy, that the name of the structure of the loop eventually becomes what we refer to as that whole downtown area. And then you quote poets. You have Edgar Lee Masters, who wrote a poem called The Loop, which talks about down in the loop, I pass beneath the loop, or around the loop the elevated crawls. And we already talked about Algren, and Hemingway has his story, a very short story, mentions leaving the loop. And it really has become this bigger symbolic thing, and that's what I just found so fascinating about this book, is how it's an idea in our heads as much as it's a structure that physically exists.
Yeah, if you can picture the bean is called the Cloud Atlas or something, Cloud
Gate. Right.
Yeah, but everybody looks at it and says, that's the bean. So there is this, and nobody sent out a memo that this is what you're going to call it. Everybody just called it the bean. There's a sculpture by Reardon that's called the Kiss. He called it something else, but everybody says that's the Kiss. Okay. So what happened with the elevated loop was it was so important. It was looming over the area so much that people referred to locations inside or outside it on the basis of the elevated loop. So at the first, it was references to land within the elevated or within the Union Loop structure. And then it was land within the Union Loop. And then it was land within the loop. And then it became land in the Loop District. And we're talking, this is taking place over a period of 10, 15 years. It's an evolution. Nobody's sending out a memo. People are just doing it. It's in the Loop District. And finally, they just say, well, it's in the Loop. And then by New Year's Eve, 1911, the Tribune writes a story about the New Year's Eve celebration at Randolph and State, where, for decades there had been celebrations, and for decades more there would be. And for the first time, the only word used to describe downtown in the Tribune story, and the Tribune wrote a story every year, was the Loop. It wasn't called the downtown. It wasn't called the Central Business District. And by that moment, you could say that's when the word loop had finally settled, and it was definitely the downtown was the Loop. And it was, again, not something that people that somebody important decided. It was something that every individual decided.
So my final question for you is, just after your long career, you were the urban affairs writer and features writer at the Tribune for 32 years. What did doing this project, how did it change how you thought about the city? Because you already knew the city pretty well. So what did you learn about the city overall Or did it change anything about how you thought about Chicago?
I think I realized how significant the physical structures of a city are for the people who live in the city. And so in this case, it was the elevated loop. My next book is going to look in some vague way, and I don't have it, about the street grid and how that has affected the way what it feels like to live in the city. And it's not just, it won't be just the street grid, it'll be the alleys, it'll be a lot of things like that. But this sense that hog butcher the world was a very poetic, nice term, but the real feel of what it felt like to live in the city wasn't really captured by it. What I want to do is, what I did in this book, I think, is to capture what it felt like to live in the city and how my life as a Chicagoan was changed because of what Yerkes did, what Waddell did, and how the elevated structure made a difference in the city that made my life different.
It's fascinating to me, and I know you're a published poet as well, and it just makes me think of how these policies create the poetry then that comes out of them. You know, they shape our lives in ways we don't even realize. And one of the things I loved about reading this book, particularly during this time, is all the memories that were flooding of my many different experiences in the loop, some special occasions or some just wandering around. And I miss that right now, you know, while we're still kind of stuck inside.
Yeah, there's a line in there from Philip Armour, who was this really rich but really sad guy who made a lot of money in selling pork during World War I, but then the bottom fell out of the market, and he was losing $1 million a day for like 130 days. Anyway, right before he died, he gave an interview with somebody and said, you know, I've had a sad life, but I only wish I could get drunk and wander around the loop. You know, and it's like, so even for a very rich guy, the loop was this place where he felt comfortable. He wanted to be able to do it. I don't think he felt he could do it because he was Philip Armour and he was a member of high society, but he knew that that's what he wanted to do. And so, you know, that sense of whether you wander around loop drunk or whether you wander around the loop just looking at everything or taking it all in, or just on your way to something, it becomes part of your life experience that's really deep.
You can check out The Loop, the L tracks that shaped and saved Chicago, here at the library. Or learn more about our guest on his website, patricktreardon.com. Thank you to Pat Reardon for taking the time to talk with us, and thank you for listening to our 46th episode. Comments and feedback are always welcome and can be sent to podcast@deerfieldlibrary.org. Go to deerfieldlibrary.org/podcast to learn more about our show and find links to subscribe. You can also follow the library on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, or check out our YouTube channel. Links are on our website or in our show notes. We'll be back next month. Thanks for listening.